Hello, my name is Kelly Ngo. I'm going to be discussing the effects of French colonialism on Vietnamese cuisine, specifically the dish pho, while showing you how I make my family's recipe pho ga, chicken pho. So let's get started.
What is pho? Well, it's a traditional Vietnamese soup that consists of usually oxtail, beef, or chicken broth with rice noodles, meat, and a generous amount of herbs and vegetables. The broth is typically made of meat bones and charred aromatics like onion, ginger, star anise, and cinnamon sticks, also known as bark, and then simmered in a large pot for several hours. The noodles may vary from thin like southern Vietnam or thicker like northern Vietnam. Pho varies a lot between the two, but it varies even more in the present day. It's known to be the national dish of Vietnam and is enjoyed at any time of the day. It has been growing in popularity in America for decades now since the migration of Vietnamese immigrants. Let's discuss how Vietnamese cuisine has been heavily influenced by French colonialism. France colonized Vietnam in the mid-19th century when they wanted to expand their economic and political influence in Southeast Asia. They attacked Da Nang, which is on the coastal side, which also helped them take control of other countries like Cambodia and Laos. This will become known as the French Indochina. France begins to exploit Vietnamese labor under their rule and change their agriculture production to benefit themselves. Vietnam begins to produce rubber, coffee, and tea for France. France also introduces new infrastructure like railways and roads to help the country's economy, but they were really trying to benefit themselves. They established a system of political power where only French officials could take part of it and excluded any Vietnamese officials. They also established an institution of education to teach the French language and culture to Vietnamese students. This caused a loss of Vietnamese culture and identity to the younger generations of this era. The French colonial rule didn't end until 1954, where Vietnam defeated them at Dien Bien Phu. The French contributed many influences to Vietnamese cuisine, which is the topic we'll be focusing on. A popular food such as banh mi has the baguette and pâté. Vietnam didn't have bread before the French introduced it to them, and bread is now currently a big part of Vietnamese cuisine. There's also a dish called bò kho, which has inspiration from French beef stews. Some say that is what solely inspired pho, but there's also some Chinese influences that has helped assist to create pho. Coffee was also introduced to Vietnam, but in contrast to France's hot, deep roasted coffee, Vietnam sweetens theirs with condensed milk and ice with occasionally whipped eggs for a creamy, delicious finish. I highly recommend it if you get the chance to try it, and you can try these dishes all over the bay since it has been globalized. Now that you know a little bit about French colonialism and its influences on Vietnamese cuisine, I'll tell you about the modernization of it. Waves of Vietnamese refugees began to come to the U.S. post-World War II between the 1970s and the 1980s. With them, they brought dreams and hopes to create a better life for themselves, as well as their rich culture and traditions, which helped them build the Vietnamese American communities in California. As the Vietnamese American communities grew, the demand for Vietnamese cuisine was also on the rise. One of the key factors to help with the popularization of pho happened in the early 2000s, 2010s, and it was the rise of food culture in the Bay Area. With the diversity and growth of restaurants in the Bay Area, many people began to share Vietnamese dishes on social media and other platforms, which led to a lot of exposure and curiosity for Vietnamese cuisine. California is known to have two of the largest communities of Vietnamese Americans in Garden Grove and San Jose. The demand for Vietnamese restaurants began to increase with a lot of new Vietnamese fusion restaurants as well. The typical meat broth of pho in these fusion restaurants moves to have a seafood base. Some are added with stir-fried garlic and shallots. Some even have eggs and other fusion dishes as well. There has been some controversy as to whether or not pho or other Vietnamese dishes have been modified too far in losing its traditional culture. However, Vietnamese cuisine was one of the first to have been created out of the concept fusion food. Food has been what helps people understand and connect to other cultures, and food will continue to evolve and change into new dishes that will be loved by many. While there is variety and changes to Vietnamese cuisine, you can always find yourself a hot bowl of pho, traditional or not, all over the bay. Thank you for listening.